So I'm Andrew. I am autistic, and I have been in a role for the last 6 months as Autism Programme Development Lead for NHS England and Improvement in the London region. That is a job that didn't previously exist before I got it. And indeed, as far as I know, it is the first time a region of NHS England has had a non-clinical job role with only autism in the title in a learning disability and autism team, which for me is a step very much in the right direction. I think for all sorts of historical reasons, we've grouped these two cohorts together, whereas actually, of course, we know that the vast majority of autistic people do not have a co-occurring, and let's call it co-occurring, learning disability. Far too often, I think we've measured these two things by each other, when in fact they're just two things that co-occur in a minority of autistic people. But it also strikes me that it is quite remarkable to have an autistic person in a role like the one I have. But of course, it shouldn't be. The fact that that does still feel quite remarkable to have an autistic person in a relatively senior role about autism is the fact that that is still quite rare, is in itself part of the problem I think we have. There's so much I could say in a short time. I always struggle a bit to keep on topic. But I think we are very much in a state of change, aren't we, when we're thinking about neurodivergence, neurodiversity, and autism in particular. Whenever I talk about autism now, I always subtitle my sessions as "The more we learn, the less we know." I think Kuran came out earlier with some stats. I have slightly different stats, but perhaps more striking. As far as my latest figures suggest that around 1 in 35 people are autistic. That's around 2.5% of the population. That's certainly the figure they use in America, the CDC, and the latest study I've seen, something from the JAMA network from March 2021 of 7 million English school kids, so pretty big study, suggests that figure would be about right as well. In other words, we know and interact with, as colleagues, friends, patients, clients, an awful lot more autistic people than we count. That is just going to be true. Indeed, anecdotally, well, perhaps I'll come back to those figures, but in my previous job before NHS England, I worked for Westminster Council in the heart of London. I was, amongst other things, the statutory autism lead, but I also set up an accessibility board for the council as an internal thing around disabled staff. And it struck me that data is just so unreliable, based, I think, still on these massive misunderstandings. We know from research that somewhere between 15 to 25%, so I'm going to go down the middle and say about 20% of people are neurodivergent in one way or another, or probably at least more than one of those things at the same time. But we also know that lots of neurodivergent people may not consider themselves as disabled. And yet on our internal HR staffing systems, there is only that one box to tick called disabled. Are we capturing the data even at that very early stage? In Westminster Council, I hope I'm not giving away any secrets here, they didn't have a disability policy. They looked at pay gaps for other groups, but not focusing right in the first place. Well, almost certainly not. I think when I have a shorter amount of time, I tend to focus on language. Because I introduce myself as autistic. And I think for all of the changes we're seeing, we have seen changes in the diagnosis, DSM-5, 2013, ICD-11's just come in. We've seen changes in criteria, in terminology, but I think the biggest change for me has been a cultural change. It's been the rise of the autistic voice, hashtags that we use on social media, like actually autistic. And I think this has been vital. I love the idea of neurodiversity. I love it as a thing, but also a concept. Uh, the word, I think, being coined by Judy Springer, who I gather chose the word on purpose to mirror the word biodiversity. The idea that some flowers flourish in deserts whilst others flourish in rainforests. You're still a perfectly good flower. You might just be in the wrong. With the rise of us as an autistic community, we are beginning to see changes happening already, but I think we are not there yet. As I said, I introduced myself as autistic, and I do think language matters because it kind of filters down and trickles down subconscious ways of thinking about things like autism. And we know in the surveys that go out, over 80% of us now prefer to be called autistic. I'm not a person with autism. I don't have it. I don't live with it. You know, I live with my cat and my partner. I can't leave my autism behind on the sofa for 5 minutes while I nip out. If I wasn't autistic, I wouldn't be Andrew. I would be someone else. It is fundamental to who I am. So the idea of separating it from me by putting it over here a bit to the left is to me the wrong idea in the first place. There is no non-autistic Andrew inside me struggling to get out. And we just know, I think, don't we, that if we describe someone as having something or a person with something, again, if I may say something offensive, but not to offend, just to make a point, we all know if I were to talk about someone as having gayness or a person with gayness, we'd all make that face of what the hell's he talking? That you can't say that. And we know in our heart of hearts why we can't say that, because that is offensive. And I think part of the message coming out of my community mirrors that journey. I think, you know, we used to diagnose being gay, didn't we, with symptoms to be good, a horrific thought these days. And I think the journey autistic people are going on culturally is not dissimilar, of being asked to be seen as different, not faulty, not broken, not less. So yes, I think starting with that changing language would not be a bad place to begin. I think for a long time, we've been using the wrong yardstick to measure a happy, successful autistic life by. And I'm sure people from other minority groups probably recognize this as well. That we've used a yardstick of a neurotypical life to measure an autistic life by. And apart from the ethics of that, which I won't get preachy about, but I'm sure you can imagine, of measuring me up against something I'm fundamentally not, as if I was not quite there yet. We know, unfortunately, the tragic statistics that have come out from those misunderstandings of trying to change autistic people. We know that autistic people without the co-occurring learning disability are top of the tree for suicide and self-harm. We know we are 8 to 9 times more likely to die. But I say this because I don't know many other autistic people, and I know lots of us, who don't have a similar story. Those of us, of course, still around to tell it. But the real kicker for me is the research that shows us that the very act of trying to measure up against this wrong yardstick, of being asked to mask and camouflage your autism because that looked like success to a neurotypical, has been shown to directly correlate with that suicidality. So the people we thought were our success stories, the people that the system thought were somehow mildly autistic, a concept that simply doesn't exist. I think we are often in danger of pathologizing personality. The act of doing that, of creating that mask, has meant the very people that most needed support were the ones we were in fact most likely to miss. And I think that, if anything, is the kicker, isn't it? That is the big, big, big thing that I think we need to change. I think autism and neurodivergence in general, I think it's been the last cab off the civil rights rank. We've watched, certainly in the UK, you can even see it, the timeline as laws came in. We've watched people from disadvantaged groups around because of their gender, sexuality, ethnicities. Disability has been the last cab off the rank anyway. But even within the disability world, I fear that autism neurodivergence has barely left the cab rank. If we took away all the wheelchair ramps tomorrow, we would quite rightly be outraged. And yet we still, as a system, NHS, social care, in some areas, commission services that demand I be something I'm not, that demand I learn to look you in the eye, to learn social skills that are neurotypicals, not mine. I have perfectly good autistic social skills, thank you very much. Demand I measure up against this ruler, which, as I say, sadly correlates with suicidality. And perhaps I'll just end with this point then, another bit of data. We know again from research that autistic to autistic communication is just fine. So fundamentally, I don't have, despite what the diagnostic criteria tells us. And remember, getting a diagnosis of autism depends on you struggling. If you are a happy, successful autistic, you probably won't even get past your GP for a referral at the moment. No wonder we undercount us. But if you are, I'm so sorry. As I come to the end here, I've once again lost my thread. I'm so sorry. I don't usually get nervous when I speak publicly, but I'm in such esteemed company that I have today. I do apologize. But I was just going to end with that communication thing just now. If talking to another autistic person, speaking my own native language, where we know communication there is just fine, then fundamentally, I do not have, by definition, I do not have that communication difficulty the diagnostic criteria tells me I have. What I do is speak a minority language, not a faulty one, not a broken one. But in any other scenario where that's true, we muddle along by trying to learn each other's language. I lived in Brazil, you can see behind me, for years. We muddled along with my broken Portuguese and people tried to help me out with their broken English. No one at any point told me to forget my English because it was a rubbish language. No one tried to stop me being that thing. And yet we still do that with autistic folk, don't we? We metaphorically take away those metaphorical wheelchair ramps. We shouldn't be doing that. Believe us, respect us for who we are, and allow us all to be our authentic selves. And I probably had better shut up there and pass back to Kuram. Thank you so much for letting me have the time here today. It's really lovely to see this grow.
Thank you so very much, Andrew. That was really enlightening. I think